meantime, thank you everybody for being here. I know you're not the one you want to hear from. I'm not the one you want to hear from. That's Rachel. So I'll be quick to introduce Salto. Salto is a configuration manager for Jira. Yes, we're not just the company that puts up these cool webinars. We also have a product. I'll post the trial link in the comments if you want to try Salto for free for 30 days. And you'll hear more about Salto throughout Rachel's sessions today. That's it for me. I think we can go ahead and get started, Rachel.
Great. Well, hi, everybody. I'm excited to talk about this topic today because I have a lot of customers that develop their own software. And when talking with them, I noticed that they have all these great software development best practices that they follow with their own software. They never, ever think of deploying straight to production. And they always test and version and back up their software. But then I ask them about their Jira practices, and for some reason, I get blank stares back. They don't use those same principles when deploying for Jira, and I don't understand why. So my goal today is to kind of inspire you to take some of those DevOps and software development lifecycle best practices to heart and bring those into your Jira application management as well. So hi, I'm Rachel Wright. I'm a certified Jira administrator and author of the Jira Strategy Admin Work. And I'm coming to you today from Florida. That's my RV at the bottom. It looks like my connection's a little slow today. That's the challenge for me for some of these webinars. So I'm going to go ahead and kill my webcam, and I'm going to devote all my bandwidth to screen share. And if for any reason I have trouble with internet, just give me a second. I'll come right on back with a different connection. So thank you in advance for your patience. I've been on the road since 2015. And if anyone has ever thought of traveling the road in an RV, I highly recommend it. I love it. It's a great lifestyle. But back to Jira. So today, Salto and I have partnered to present today's topic, which is taking the risk out of Jira deployments. And I've been using Jira since 2011. I got certified in 2016, and I'm an independent consultant. So I'm going to share ways to safely deploy changes between Jira environments and backup issue and configuration data. So here's our agenda for today. First, I'll share some deployment horror stories that I've experienced over the years. And then we'll discuss some ways to move changes between environments. Next, we'll talk about backing up Jira issue and configuration data in case there's a problem with one of your changes. And then I'll show you how deployment and backup is so much easier using Salto. You'll never want to go back. And after, I'll share some resources so you can continue your Jira journey. And then, of course, at the end, there'll be a Q&A, and I'll try to answer any questions that you have. All right, so let's get started with some deployment horror stories. So I've made a lot of deployment mistakes over the years, and I've got 3 stories to share with you today. And the first one is about a total lack of process. So I got my start in web development in the late 90s. I taught myself HTML, and I spent every minute that I had learning how to manipulate text with markup. I really, really loved it. It was my favorite thing to do. And I was frequently skipping class to go to the computer lab and work on the school's website. And for some reason, my teachers let me do it. They let me skip class. They knew exactly what I was doing, and they were fine with it. I never got sent to the principal's office. But when the lab manager wasn't looking, I would install a lightweight text editor and a file transfer client on the lab computers. And bonus points, if anybody remembers what any of these software are. On the left is a home site, which was a HTML text editor made by Alaire and bought by Macromedia. And on the right is WSFTP, a FTP file transfer client. I think that one's still around, actually. But man, these were fun days, right? So I would transfer the files between the local lab machine and the school's web server. And I thought transferring files was a deployment process. So since the computers were wiped clean at the end of every day, there was no way that I could store any kind of local copy of the website to test against. So I just downloaded a file made my changes, uploaded it back to production, and essentially tested it there. And sometimes I would save a few files to a zip drive. Anybody remember zip drive? And then I would attempt to take those home and maybe test them there, but that never worked out too well. Something would change on the server overnight. And of course, my copy of the file was no longer the latest. So obviously, this lack of process led to missing files and broken images, outdated code. I'd frequently overwrite some of my friends' code, and that never worked out well. I had markup errors and, you name it. So those were the days before CSS, and all the content was in tables. So, if you forget to close one table cell, your entire page was no longer readable. So I was constantly ruining the website. So I learned early on how not to do web development, just like I learned how not to do Jira administration by making all the mistakes. And those initial years, yeah, those were pretty painful. But I think learning what not to do is also a very valuable learning experience. So next, I have a story about an avoidable mistake that I made in Jira. So Jira Service Management, and Confluence can all display an announcement banner at the top of pages in the application. So I use this all the time for welcome messages and system notifications, alerts, or even just to distinguish between environments. Like in my test environment, I'll put a little note at the top saying that it is the test environment. And in cloud, the message is formatted with wiki markup. But in server and data center, the message accepts HTML. Well, great, because I know HTML, but you have to be really careful with this power. So one day I was adding an HTML banner and my cat jumped up on my keyboard and he submitted my half-written code. So the result, Jira failed to load any page content below that top banner. So almost everything on the page wouldn't load. The only remedy, I had to stop Jira, remove records from the database, and restart the application. And of course, this happened in production. So I heard somewhere that if you cover your desk with aluminum foil, that cats will avoid that area. But as you can see, this did not help at all that day. He didn't care at all about the aluminum foil. And instead, we had to have a chat about his work performance. But for me, on the other hand, I learned another hard lesson about writing code inside of Jira. I got a reminder to close all my markup tags, and I learned the importance of deploying changes strategically outside of peak use hours. Okay, number 3. So here's a mistake I made when I was working with a third-party Jira app that was installed in Jira Server. So one day I discovered that one of my heavily used apps wasn't compatible with our current Jira version. And additionally, the app had changed from free to paid. So what did I do? I foolishly clicked that Buy Now button on the Manage Apps admin page. And I assumed that that was just going to take me to a shopping cart and I would view the pricing information and the feature information and make a decision about what to do. Well, I assumed wrong. Instead, it immediately installed an unlicensed version of the new app code. And I was immediately inundated by reports of license errors from users, and the workflows that the app features provided all broke. So I know you would never make this mistake, just me. But if you did, how would you handle this situation? So here are some choices. Vote by just putting a number in the chat. Your choices are type 1 for request funding for the app, type 2 for roll back the Jira version, 3 for roll back the app version, 4 for research alternative apps to use instead, 5, well, you never would have clicked that Buy Now button, so this never would have happened, or 6, something else. So what would you do if you did this in production? Stick a number in the chat if you have a vote. And then I'll tell you what I did. Oh, thank you, Baptiste, for the poll. That's great. All right, I see some votes rolling in. Okay, just give it another couple seconds. Okay. Baptiste, is there a way to show poll results? Excellent, thank you. Okay, so choice 5 is the most popular, and that is the choice where you are smarter than me and never would have clicked buy now. So great. That's a perfect decision. Choice 1, the second most popular, is the one that I went with, and choice 1 was request funding for the app. So that's what I had to do. I had to quickly generate a free trial license to restore functionality. So I sheepishly walked myself down to the purchasing department, hung my head and secured some emergency funding for the new app. So, of course, the worst part of all this was I did it, of course, in production. I had a sandbox all of this had I just thought more about what my click was going to do. So, never click a button without knowing what the outcome might be. I could have just launched my sandbox, clicked the button there to see, and avoided this whole mess. Or, I could have visited the Atlassian marketplace. I could have looked at the app vendor's website to get pricing and feature information, but I did none of that. Instead, I made an assumption, and that assumption was dead wrong. So, another lesson learned the hard way. So now, of course, we know we shouldn't make changes directly in production. I learned that the hard way. But what are our options, and how should we manage the complexities of having multiple environments? So first, to start, of course, we need a test environment, and a separate environment is really the safest way to experiment and explore features without impacting real production data. So today, if you don't have a sandbox, that is your homework for tonight. You need to set one of those up. So there are many test environment options in cloud, and let's take a quick look at your options for each. So if you have Cloud Premium or the Enterprise plan, Sandbox functionality is already built right in. Just visit admin.atlassian.com and click on the products link in the top navigation bar, and then click the Sandbox link in the left sidebar. And this Sandbox feature operates as a replica of your production environment. It's connected to production. It has a similar URL. It has the same user limits, and it has similar data. And you can create a sandbox for each product, like one for Jira Service Management, and one for Confluence. And you can create sandboxes, delete them, and copy production data at any time. After the cloud sandbox is created, click the Copy Production Data button, and then choose whether to copy some or all project data. And you can either include or exclude attachments as well. And so before the copy, Atlassian will estimate how long it will take and summarize the data. So obviously, if you exclude attachments, it's going to be a quicker process. And you can't yet copy data from the sandbox back to production though. So we'll come back to that concept in a minute. If you happen to be an Atlassian Marketplace developer, you could sign up for a free development instance. That's an option out there. And developer assets are subject to the Atlassian developer terms, which are an additional set of terms to the regular terms of service. So this license comes with a limited number of users for test purposes. So for example, you could only have one JSM user agent and 5 Jira software users, but that's out there. There's also a free version of Cloud that you could leverage. And it's just like the paid version, except it includes less features. So one thing that's always trips me up is it doesn't include project or issue permissions. So it's not going to help you if you need to test something in those areas. So that's why I kind of prefer the other ideas. But there's a couple other options to know about too for cloud. You could get a second application instance and just pay for a small amount of users. You could also start a new free trial. And I like to do this if you're testing the features of a different cloud plan and you don't want to just upgrade or downgrade production quite yet. So if you want to know what's different in a different tier, sign up for the free trial and do it there. And finally, if you can't do any of these other options, at least create a test Jira project in your production application. Sometimes I do both. Sometimes I have a sandbox environment and I still have a test project in production. I just like to be safe, right? I like to have backups of backups. That's just me. Okay, so for data center, here are some of your options. You'll want to replicate your application, and you can do it using a physical server or a virtualized solution. And Atlassian's got great instructions in their documentation at this URL shown. But whatever you do, just make sure that your configuration matches your production settings as much as possible. Also, you can get a dev license for any existing commercial or academic license holder. And this lets you deploy a non-production installation of their software. And the dev license maintenance expiration, it's synced to the maintenance expiration of your product. So any paid customer can get this. Once you have the license key for a dev application, log into Jira as an application administrator, and you can apply it on the versions and licenses page in the applications admin area. And there's also a 30-day free trial available that you could leverage. Visit my.atlassian.com and click the new trial license link to start a trial. And then again, if you have no better option, at least create a test Jira project in your production application. Sometimes I create a test Jira project of every type. So for example, this is a Jira server or data center software project. I would also create a service management project and a core or business or work management project. So I have one of each to kind of test different scenarios against. Okay, great. So we've got a sandbox environment. We've made some changes in it. We've tested them and we're ready to move them to production. So how do we do that? As I mentioned earlier, Jira Cloud Premium and Enterprise has a feature that lets you copy production data down to a sandbox. But that feature doesn't have a way to move the changes in the other direction though. So what are your options? You can move the changes manually. Some changes can be imported, or you can use apps from the Atlassian Marketplace. So let's use a request to create and deploy a simple new automation rule as an example. So here's the request. The description says, when an issue is created and the priority equals highest, assign the field to user Rachel Wright. So obviously this is super simple, but I've been burned before. So I'll follow a proper change management process and I'll create this rule in a test environment first. So first I'll create the rule in a sandbox. Sorry, my slides got out of sync. Here we go. So I'll create this rule in my sandbox environment. And then step 2, if I'm following DevOps best practices, I'll update my change issue in Jira and I'll have someone else review my changes. And then once my change is tested, it's time to document what I did. All right, stay with me here. I know this won't sound like a lot of fun to most of you, but here are the reasons that I document automation rules and really all of my Jira changes in general. So first, the best way to make sure I understand what's going on in the background is to write my own documentation. And the documentation provides a useful reference for when I forget all the important details going on in the background in a few months. And I always do, right? There's hundreds of automation rules. There's no way I can remember how everything works. Next, if you ever need to rebuild a rule, you'll be really glad to know what the specific configuration settings were. I have customers come to me all the time and ask me, hey, how does this work? And if I don't have documentation, I don't know. Or if they've broken something, it takes 10 times longer to fix it if I don't have any documentation of my own. Also, the documentation creates a searchable library of rule settings. I love having my own little code library of all the rules. And then if another customer wants a similar rule, I've got a starting point. That's really helpful also when I know I built a rule once or I built something similar, but I just don't remember what I called it. So I can go search my own little code library for it. And finally, documentation, of course, serves as a historical and a legal record of what was done and why. So your documentation strategies should also answer the following questions specifically for automation rules. What are the important details to know? Which triggers, conditions, branches, and actions are used in the rule? And what are each component's individual options and settings? And additionally, I want to provide additional information when it applies. So think about details like why a rule was built or how or where it's used and any complexities to be aware of, which are really helpful to have. So if I fall off a bridge tomorrow, is my companion Jira administrator at the company going to be able to understand what I built? What would they like to know? What would be helpful for them to take on the work that I had started? And then also make sure that any terms that you might want to search for in the future are included. Okay, so I have a live example of one of my automation rule documentation pages to show you. I just have to figure out which window it's in. It's in this window. So of course I document everything in Confluence. So here's that simple rule we talked about just for high priority assignment. And at the top of my Confluence page is a simple table that shows all the rule details. And especially what Jira issue did I use to create this rule? Because everything that I change in Jira should have a Jira issue, right? We document our Jira changes in Jira. And then I also put a screenshot or two of rule details, so it's easy to recreate in the future. I export the rule in JSON format, so I can import the rule if needed. Also, this is a handy way to search the rules components for specific IDs or names, or to put it into another Jira application. And then all the different components and the details about the components I document in a table below. So this simple rule only has one trigger, one condition, and one action. And then what other information might be helpful to know about how this rule operates? Because the rule itself just has that one description field, and there isn't really a whole lot of, way to put this metadata in there. So this is what I would want somebody else to know if they're trying to understand this rule. And now if I'm trying to find out how many of my automation rules have a specific user embedded in them, I can just search this code library instead of searching the JSON files, or instead of opening up each different rule in my Jira application, which could take years if I have a lot of rules. So this is what I do. I know this is probably overkill for some of you, but this has saved me in the past. And for me, it's well worth doing. Okay, that was my live example. Back to PowerPoint. All right, so I've done my documentation, and at this point, I'm ready to make my change in production. And here comes the dreaded split screen experience I know you all have been through. On the left side is my documentation. I've carefully written down everything that I did in my sandbox environment so I can recreate that change in production. And on the right is my production application. I'm ready to make those same changes. And then, of course, there's me sitting behind the computer screen. I'm anxious, holding my breath, and hoping that I don't break anything when I try to recreate this all in production. So now in case of automation rules, at least in Jira Cloud, we get a little bit of help. So I can breathe a little bit. So unlike in other areas of Jira, automations have an import and an export function. So let's utilize this much safer. So in your test environment, go to the global automation page in the system admin area. And then next to the rule, click the ellipsis icon and click the export option. And then save the rule to your computer in JSON format. Next, in the production environment, go to the same global automation page in the system admin area, and then click the ellipsis at the top right of the page and select import rules. So now all that's left to do is perform a subset of tests just to make sure all is well in production and close our change tracking Jira issue. All right, so here are some tips for deploying manually. Let's use a different scenario because automations are obviously easier because they have that nice import and export feature. So first, Let's say that you've been tasked with removing some unneeded Jira custom fields to do this all the time. So you'll want to research all the potential impacts on objects like filters, boards, workflows, automation rules, apps, scripts, and probably a lot more. So try to think of all the things that could possibly break. That's where I start. And then make a list of all those items and take really good notes when you go as you go. So this list is going to be helpful now, and it'll serve as a checklist for future similar efforts. And make sure to document all the names and the IDs and any elements that are impacted. So as you know, in Jira, names are not always unique. So I once had a customer that had 4 fields named assignee. So there was that standard field that we all have called assignee, and then they had 3 additional custom fields, all with the same display name. Horrible. So we definitely wanted to clean that up. But the only way to keep them straight during the cleanup effort was to refer to them by their unique IDs. So I always write those down. And of course, you'll also need name and ID information to redo any actions in production. Next, be sure to record how long any cleanup efforts or changes took to accomplish in the test environment. And then I like to add a 25% buffer to estimate how long it's going to take to do the same work in production. So, production is constantly changing, and there could be some recently added, edited, or removed elements or new surprise dependencies to address. So always allow more time than you think that you will need. Sounds fun, right? Not so much. But before we make any major changes, we should definitely back up. And backup plays an important part in your deployment process. And here are some strategies for you to consider. So first, it's good to make a list of things to back up. As you see, I really like having lists. Lists keep me accurate, keep me sane. I'm interested in backing up individual issues, attachments, configuration information like schemes, settings, workflows, automation rules, and app setting. And then in server and data center, if I've made any customizations, like added new code, made changes to config files, property files, proxy settings, paths, I'd want to back all that information up too. All right, before we go any farther, I want to mention that I don't feel like there's one single perfect Jira backup strategy out there. So like a patchwork quilt, I prefer to use many different methods at the same time. That way I have multiple options and backups for my backups. I'm very risk adverse. I'd rather have many strategies and many options and not rely on one that could fail or one that might not serve my needs in all scenarios. So think about backups for backups. So here are some options in cloud. And here are some similar options in data center. And we'll take a quick look at each of these. So cloud has a built-in backup function in the system admin area. It's called the backup manager. And the purpose is for re-importing information either back into the current cloud site or into a different cloud site, like a test environment, for example. And you can choose whether to include attachments, avatars, and logos, like in the checkbox shown. So it's checked by default. You can uncheck it if you want, and then click the form submission button. So Jira will create a downloadable file in zip format. So download that file and store it somewhere safe, ideally in a central code repository, not ideally on your local machine, which could get lost. That download link is available for 14 days. So this is a process that you would have to do multiple times. It's not automated, but it's a good start. So server and data center has a similar utility. It's called the backup system feature, and you access it from the system admin area too. It's been a long time since I've used this function, but I remember when I used to use it that the larger your application got, the less reliable that this function was. So if you have a really, really large instance, make sure that this export actually completes in the background. And saying that in another way, test the validity of the export file. The feature saves a zip file in the export directory on the server. So you'll also need server access to get to that file. And unlike the cloud backup utility, the export doesn't include attachments. So you'll need to back up the attachments directory separately. Okay, so I just used the cloud backup manager or the data center backup system feature, and now I deserve a coffee, right? I got to stop using this picture. It just makes me hungry for coffee. All right, but not so fast. No coffee break for me. Aside for importing that backup file I just took to an environment, there's not much else I'm able to do with that file or the data in it. I encourage you to go get that file and explore it and see the structure of it. I'm glad I have that option, but I shouldn't solely rely on it. So here's the scenario. This is an email I get from customers all the time. This example says, "Hi, Rachel, remember that workflow you built for us in 2016? We broke it. Can you restore it so it works like it did before?" I probably don't remember what I built for them. And finding it in an archive, no matter how great that backup system they use, would be pretty challenging. So here's an example of where I want to take my own additional backups. So for me, a combination of a full system backup, with a real backup utility and a strategic manual backup of important items really works well. So first, I periodically manually back up any issues that I think might be important, like issues I use to build and document workflows, for example. That would be an easy way to restore that customer's workflow to what it was originally, because it would be in that Jira ticket. And the best export method depends on the intended use. So to simply save the information in a different format, use the print list or print details, Microsoft Word, or HTML formats. And this works really well for viewing or creating like a personal poor man's secondary backup. And then to manipulate the data or save it in a structured way or import it into another Jira application, then use the CSV or XML formats. You can open CSV data as a spreadsheet and do your own data analysis. And then, of course, to share data with other applications, choose the RSS format. All right, so there's always caveats to be aware of. First, it's good to know that exporting issues from the user interface is not at all a robust backup method. It's not the same as a database backup or a snapshot. You'll have important information missing, like transitions, change history, comments, attachments. All that information will be missing. And also, most applications will limit you to 1,000 issues at a time. So if I'm trying to export 5,000 issues, that means I need to export 1,000 issues 5 times. And if you're simply creating an online version of issue data, exporting works just fine. Manual exports can be a great complement to your backup strategy, but they shouldn't be your only backup strategy. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, I'm risk adverse, so there's no such thing as too many backups. I'm constantly backing up and exporting Jira settings, so I have a copy for safekeeping or to import into other Jira applications. So in all deployment types, you can export workflows as XML format, or you can use Atlassian's proprietary JWB format. Now, I like the XML format because I can open it in a text editor and see all the statuses, transitions, behaviors, and their IDs. And it makes it really easy to search for a specific rule, a group, or a transition screen I'm looking for. Kind of similar to the automation example I showed you earlier. So in server and data center, you can even import single workflows. So that's a nice little feature to have. The features at the top right of the workflows page in the application admin area. But unfortunately, there's no similar import function for Jira Cloud. But you can import public workflows from the Atlassian Marketplace. You'll find that option in the workflows page in the application admin area up there at the top right. So as I mentioned earlier, the built-in automation rules in Jira Cloud can be easily imported and exported either individually or in bulk in JSON format. So just like XML, JSON is easy to read. You can open it in text editor and search for elements by their name or ID. It's really helpful to me when I'm trying to find something. And this may seem too pedantic for some of you, but I often take screenshots of specific Jira configuration elements, and this has really saved me over the years. So my favorite things to take screenshots of are the summary page for any Jira projects I build. So when somebody requests a new project, the first thing I do before I turn it over to them and say it's ready to use is I take the screenshot. And then in a few months after they've made changes to it, I can compare and I can understand why things are working differently and help them with it. I also like to take a screenshot of a project's issue type scheme page because it shows this nice table matrix of each issue type's workflow, field config, and screen association. That's helpful. And then I take screenshots of workflows in both diagram and text mode. So I've had a company come to me once before with a screenshot of only diagram mode, and they wanted me to rebuild the workflow. Well, okay, I can rebuild the statuses and the transitions easily, but I don't know what's going on in the background. So don't forget to take that XML backup as well, because that's the only way you're going to get that data. But this is something, right? This is a good start at least. And then I like to grab the automation diagrams too. That's an easy way to understand what's happening. In this example, I would probably take three. I would take an example of what the settings are for the trigger, the settings for the condition, and the settings for the action. And then any settings for third-party apps. So screenshots or Confluence documentation for me saves me a lot of time, especially when I'm trying to figure out what changed. So document and back up any information that you would not want to lose or have to go dig for. And then last but not least, a great complement to your manual backup strategy is a dedicated backup app from the Atlassian Marketplace. There are many to choose from. Go to marketplace.atlassian.com, search for the term backup to see all the options. All right, here are some questions to answer when you're crafting your own backup strategy. So we'll start with what elements are important to you to back up. And make sure your backup plan includes issue metadata like comments, change history, and attachments. Again, if you export Jira issues, it won't include this information. So make sure your robust backup strategy has another method that does. Next, what frequency will you back up on? So I back up some important items on a set schedule, like monthly or quarterly, depending on what it is. And then I back up other items right after I build them or when there's a need that presents itself. Next, where are those backups stored? And ideally, the answer is in a versioned central code repository and not in your personal hard drive, where it's easy to get lost or corrupted. Next, how long are backups retained? Now, your company probably already has a corporate data retention policy, so just leverage that same information for Jira data. And then how is access to the backup file secured? You need to have a process for that as well. And finally, how are your backup files and procedures validated? It's one thing to take backups. That's another thing to make sure the backup can actually be used in an emergency. So regardless of your deployment type, you've got to regularly do these backups and import the data to make sure it works. You've got to make sure that Jira is part of your corporate disaster recovery plan. All right, so far today, everything I've talked about for deployment and configuration backup examples, they've all been manual tasks. But obviously, manual deployments and backups are not ideal. So manual work, it's time consuming, prone to human error, and there's no good way to roll back if you run into unexpected complexities. So luckily, the Salto Configuration Manager for Jira app can compare differences, manage dependencies, validate changes, and manage the deployment process for you. This is really cool. Can't wait to show you. Salto can also handle errors and roll back your Jira configuration to a previous state if you ever have a problem. And it keeps a before and after history of configuration changes for backup purposes. So 3 easy steps. Here's how it works at a high level. First, sign up for Salto and connect your Jira Cloud or Data Center Sandbox and production applications by entering just a few connection details. And then have Salto fetch your application's configuration data. So in minutes, you'll see all the objects in your Jira software, Jira Service Management, or Confluence application. So here's an example of the configuration elements in my Jira application. And in the left sidebar, I've expanded the list of elements and selected one of my custom fields. And on the right of the screen, Salto shows the configuration settings and the dependencies for that specific custom field. All right, so next, let's say I've cleaned up some unused, unneeded fields in my sandbox application. So let's use Salto to compare the configuration differences between two environments. So Salto detected over 1,000 configuration differences between two of my applications. Now, can you imagine deploying all these differences manually? No, thank you. I'm not interested in doing any of that. So, all right, there's over 1,000, but what if I want to just deploy a couple of changes? Well, that's fine too. With Salto, you can deploy a single change, you can deploy an entire Jira project with all of its schemes and settings, or multiple changes and Jira projects together. You choose. So this way, pick and choose the elements that are ready to go to production, and then you won't impact other changes that are in progress in the sandbox development environment. Next, another cool feature in Salto is that you can connect to any Git-based source code platform like Bitbucket or GitHub, GitLab, or Azure DevOps. And the beauty of a source code repository is it gives you a central place to store and version code or configuration files, documentation, other objects. Why not version your Jira configuration, right? It's not just for software development. It's also for Jira. So with Salto and a repo connected, Salto is going to manage all your deployment branching, your committing, pushing, and merging the code for you. There's no need to execute any Git commands unless that's something you really like to do, and then you can do it if you want to. And then after a Jira change is deployed, all the details are automatically and properly documented in Jira, in your repository, and in Salto. So there's no more guessing who changed what or when. You have a proper audit trail now. And additionally, you can set up deployment pipelines for a visual deployment trail. So pipelines help you understand the current state of all Jira modifications and helps you promote them or roll them back between environments. So that's a really nice feature to have. And then finally, you can track changes to the configuration over time, which is a much better backup strategy than my manual screenshots will ever provide. So here are some helpful links. I recommend you take a screenshot real quick. For more information about deploying Jira changes and connecting Jira to a code repository, check out my DevOps for Jira series. And then for a list of Jira test environment options, see the article on my website and use the third link to sign up for a Salto free trial. All right, now it is time for some Q&A. I will try to find the Q&A feature of Zoom, and I will try to get my camera running again. Cross your fingers that I can do any of these things. I'm great at Jira, not so much at Zoom. All right, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A section.
All right, thanks, Rachel. For anybody that's still there, and that's most of you guys, feel free to use the Q&A module in Zoom to ask any questions about the presentation or anything else that Rachel might be able to answer. In the meantime, as we give attendees a few minutes to ask their questions if they have any, is there anything that maybe you feel you didn't have the time to include in the slides, or more of an edge case that you haven't mentioned because you thought it might not be super valuable, or is there anything that you might want to add?
Well, I'd love to hear from anyone else who has other horror stories and how that they um, address some of those challenges, because I know it's not just me out there who's, been through this. And there are so many stories. I just had to pick three of them, but we've all made production errors. We've all done things we wish we hadn't done. So if there are other stories out there, I'd love to hear them.
There is a question from Brian in the chat, not in the Q&A module if you want to check it.
Hi, Brian. I'll read your question. Thank you. It says, as a large organization, we have multiple Jira instances. Oh yeah, that's fun. The IT team is always migrating data from other instances into a central instance. Oh, sorry, my screen jumped. Which inevitably causes duplicate fields, etc. Yep. What do you recommend as a best practice for migrating, merging data, big data from another instance into existing instances while minimizing the impact on existing users? Yeah, that's a great question. And you know what? What's interesting is every now and then somebody will come to me with a use case that they'll argue that this duplicate field that they have is actually warranted. So, before they argued that, I would have had a different answer for you. I'm assuming in your use case, it's more like my assignee use case where they had four assignee fields and there's no like real business use case for that. But for me, I always try to be proactive. And I don't know that you have this ability reading what you wrote, but I try to police what's about to go into my most important Jira application before it does. So if you have the ability to clean up and avoid that duplication before it happens, that's obviously the best case scenario. Second case scenario is, addressing that when it happens. As you know, anytime you do a cleanup, it's going to impact your users. And what is the scope? The impact is the important first question to answer. How many filters are going to break? How many boards are going to break? So move slowly, move deliberately. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's a problem that we all face. And I also wanted to mention one great thing I love about Salto is that the configuration gets translated into text files. So it's really easy for you to detect that information. Especially like I think you said that you're in data center. So you have a little bit more insight into your application. But for those of us in cloud, like it's a total black box, right? We can't see into our configuration very well. But with Salto, we have the ability now to see the different elements, to see the dependencies, and to translate that information into text files. So it kind of gives us insight that we don't have, and now we can see those dependencies and plan for them much better. Cloud, we're blind as Jira administrators sometimes.
There was
The
a question from Abhilash. Does Salto support to trigger deployments in GitHub from Jira? Um, I'm not sure I know the answer to that. I know you can track deployments in GitHub. I don't know if you can um, trigger a deployment in GitHub. It might be a question. I mean, do you know the answer, Rachel? At that point, you might know the product better than I do. Okay, I'll get back to you, Abhilash. In the meantime, you can always try Salto for 30 days and see, like, for those 30 days, you have access to all of the features, so you can try it for yourself, and I'll reach out to you with an answer. And we still have a few more minutes for questions if there's anything left. Otherwise, we'll end here for today. There, just posted in the chat. I'll also start a poll to try and understand what you thought about today's session and if you think Salto could be useful to you. So make sure to answer that poll if you have a minute before leaving. And as you stay around to answer the poll, we'll also stay around for a minute or two, see if there's any more questions. I see another question in the chat. Is there a particular Confluence template you use for documenting your system, or do you just use Salto as documentation? From Susan.
So All of the above. Most of them I've built my own, to be honest. Some of them I've made available as a download, so you can kind of get an idea of how I do it and then create your own template. But that's definitely a good point. Like make your own template library and then get your fellow Jira admins to use the same kind of documentation and communication strategy. So you're all doing it in the same way. I like that question, Susan. Also think about like no matter how great a system can't tell you why you made a certain decision. Only a human can explain the details behind what the strategy was. So the system can tell you what it is or what changed and when, but the system can't necessarily describe why. So that's why I still do some manual documentation. I'm so happy to have applications and apps and systems and processes that can do a lot of automated documentation for me. But there's still some that I think a human will always want to do.
All right, I think we'll end it here for today. Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you so much, Rachel, for today's session, and I hope to see you again soon for another one. Bye, everybody.